You know, if I had more time and energy, I'd do this as a proper episode of 90s Comics Retrial. But since I have neither the time nor the spare energy, we're going to talk about it a bit more straightforward. This is a commissioned review, the first issue of something called Ragmop. I had never heard of this. And it's been around for a while. This is from Rob Walton, who did the writing and the art. This first issue, it's a mad, 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 mad universe. This came out in 95. And it's a thing. I'll tell you what, right off the bat, without giving my overall opinion away, if this were to be on 90s Comics Retrial, it would kind of break the rubric by which that show worked. God, I'm assuming people know what that is. That was originally a podcast project. I did 2 different iterations of it on the main Council of Geeks channel. That was the most recent one and probably the best it's ever going to look. But it never performed especially well once I tried to go video with it, and I didn't have the effort to keep going with the podcast format. So I let it go. But in any case, the standard metric of that was seeing if something from 90s was guilty of 90s era awfulness. 90s era awfulness being, a lot of extreme stuff and over-detailed art and excessive pouches and everybody has a bad attitude. And it's all about crossovers with about 5 different comics, like that kind of stuff. If you were in the 90s, you knew. No matter what I think of this, it does none of that. So this is not a comic where I could really do a plot rundown. And it's not because there isn't a plot. There is, but it kind of doesn't matter. So, all right, how do I want to go about this? This issue jumps across millions of years of time, setting up multiple plot lines, everything from dinosaurs on a spaceship. Yeah, they beat Doctor Who to that by more than a decade. So you've got that. You have these sort of very Wall Street business tycoons prepared to just destroy the earth because their greed is natural. And so let's just roll with it because this is what we do. You have an absolute idiot for a president. For the record, during this period in time, Clinton would have been president. I don't think it's supposed to be him specifically, though. We just have an absolute moron president. There is this woman who wants to be a supervillain, and she's like in this sort of for hire gig where her agent, instead of getting her supervillain gigs, keeps trying to get her like stripper and peep show work. So she's in the mix. There's some weird guy who's kind of like seems to be pulling all the strings behind the president. There are these scientists at the very end who just walk out and find something that crashed into Earth. We don't know what it is. That's your issue ending cliffhanger. But like to give you an idea of tone, when the last thing that gets covered is the scientists and the thing falling to Earth. When they notice that it lands, one of them asks, should we go out and check that? And the other one says, well, if we don't, we won't have a plot. Like that's what this is. And then as they're walking, they have a very in-depth discussion about who was the best Looney Tunes director. So it's wearing its influences on its sleeve, and it is very cartoonish. Like the cover art is representative of what the interior art is as well. It is black and white. So I believe if this wasn't independent, it was definitely small press printing. And I don't think even all of the characters on the front of this have been introduced. We introduced some concept of this thing called the O-ring, which it would seem is the thing that everybody wants. There's a raccoon in a suit. We didn't get to him yet. Here's the thing. The one thing this does that was not particularly atypical for the 90s or even now, but especially at the time, was sort of layering in a big, complex, multi-character story, basically trying to launch in a single issue, the kind of thing that, say, the X-Men comics were doing across having like 4 or 5 concurrent books. And so this is kind of a lot of things at the time would kind of present it as if, okay, all those stories that would be spread across those books, you're going to get a much smaller dose of each of those stories crammed into one issue so that you'll like it enough to buy enough that we'll get to do a second issue and start to pan some of this out. And it never works. Ever works. Except it kind of does here. Again, because of the tone. I mean, the big problem with 90s, honestly, is the 90s, in comics at least, took itself way too seriously. Even the stuff that was like trying to make fun of itself, it was kind of being self-serious about it. Like there was the stuff that was absolutely straight-faced. But then there was even the stuff that was trying to be irreverent, it was very try hard. It was putting an awful lot of effort into trying to be irreverent, and it just came across as too self-serious. It would take the idea of being silly too seriously, and it would still not work. This actually works. Because the silliness is legitimately silliness. It is not just a facade of it. It's not a gimmick. Like, this is cartoonish. That is what it wants to be. That's what it is. And it makes that clear immediately with the dinosaurs talking openly. One of them talking about how they just like heard a lecture from someone who claimed that dinosaurs evolved from fish, and they're like, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. And they're making pop culture references, like modern day pop culture references, and not even like Flintstones adjusted for the time period, like taking something from our time and making it a stone pun or something. Not even that, just flat out pop culture references. So that's either going to bounce you off within the first few pages, or you're going to go, okay, there are virtually no rules. Gotcha. And that's the thing. I think that any narrative, while it does need to be entertaining in and of itself, I think that any narrative, any story can work as long as it follows its own rules. And that can come down to like straight logistical stuff, like when science fiction things sort of contradict the things they've set out, or similarly with fantasy, or it can be the rules of the tone it has set out. And that's where things can derail, where suddenly something shifts gears into a completely different notion and form and feel to it. And you're like, wait, what? No, these don't go together. Like, you set expectations of me for what to expect, then you broke that in a way that wasn't exciting. It's like, what the hell? As long as you stick within your own rules, you can work. And basically, the first rule this sets up is there's no rules. Like, it kind of is like that Little Caesars advertisements. There's no rules. Sir, put your shirt back on. There's one rule. That's kind of the tone of this entire issue. Now, I don't know. I think this thing might even still be running. I don't know if that tone was held all the way through, because the vibe I get off this, or at least the potential vibe, reminds me a little bit of Sluggy Freelance, which, oh God, if you don't know what that is, I cannot explain what Sluggy Freelance is. But short version, it's a web comic that started out as a gag-a-day comic, but eventually started doing much bigger, more intricate, and at times even emotionally charged stories, while still having absolutely ridiculous characters and bizarre settings. This setup and the characters in it, the world is creating, I could see going in that direction. I don't know if it does, but I could definitely see it doing that. There are some jokes that are legitimately really funny. There's this one, which I actually took a picture of and tweeted out, because when I read that, I was like, okay. And, you know, some of its satire still works. You think something in the 90s, when it's doing some more or less topical stuff, like when it's skewering the businessmen who are all like, yes, there are finite resources, but greed is what we do, and that's just how we're going to do it. Like, that shouldn't still be relevant. It is. Almost depressingly so now. I think it probably would have read as almost quaint at the time. But the humor, despite being very of the time and having that kind of Animaniacs, just chaos vibe to it, which does feel very 90s, it's aged decently. Like, I have some nostalgia for the era in which this was written and published, but I don't know this thing. I have no nostalgia for this specifically, but it gave me good feelings. This weird, bizarre, funny, well-drawn for a cartoonish art style little thing. Yeah. Could have done without the one visual swastika reference. It is a joke. Like, the character it's on, it's meant to show that, like, part of emphasize how stupid they are. I still could have done without that, but, like, that's, I think, kind of only my one notable criticism. Ragmop. I don't know how many people know what this is. If you do, I'd love to hear more about it. Drop your thoughts down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Like, share, subscribe. Patreon. It's how I was commissioned to review this, and how you can commission me to review other stuff. And this thing. It's something else. No pressure on the support. Like, I super appreciate it. This is my living, but, you know, don't worry too much about it. Take a relaxed attitude around here, so come on back next time you need a break. Patreon shout-outs. Thank you to Turok, Shane Ross, Oliver B., Melinda Walters, Robin Powell, Phrenobulax, the Poodle, Beetleon, Tracy Scrabbit, Dharma Michael Doyle, Vincent Paul Bartolucci, Angry Caspero, Adam Lefty Taylor, Robin Moore, Shayla Gourlay, and Bookworm. You can support me as well. Hear me mispronounce your name. Sure, I got some of those wrong.